Joining us now, a lead prosecutor in Robert Mueller's special counsel's office, Andrew Weissmann. He also served as chief of the Justice Department's criminal fraud section and as general counsel for the FBI under Director Mueller. He's now an MSNBC legal analyst and author of the new book, Where Law Ends: Inside the Mueller Investigation. And Andrew, I have a couple of questions for you about where the investigation stopped and why. But can I first ask you about these tax returns, what they tell you on the face of it from what we've seen so far as released by the New York Times?
I think the tax returns tell me that this is something that we really should have looked at. One of the things that I describe for readers, and I'm going to tell you now for your viewers, is the very difficult decisions we had to make in this investigation. I think the first thing to note is when you investigate the President of the United States for 22 months, you are living under a sword of Damocles because the President of the United States has the ability to pull the plug on your investigation at any moment. And early on in the investigation, we issued a subpoena to Deutsche Bank, and the White House called us up, irate, asking, are you doing a financial investigation into the president? That does not normally happen. I've investigated organized crime cases. I've investigated Enron. Usually the person you are investigating does not have the ability to demand an answer with the threat of pulling the plug on your investigation. So Director Mueller had a very difficult decision, at least at that early stage of the investigation. Do you go ahead with the investigation and risk being fired? Or, as he decided, do you go forward? And as we know, he was able to, with a lot of help from wonderful agents and prosecutors, prove what Russia did, how it hacked into the election, how it hacked into the DNC. It was helping candidate Trump. We proved, and this was the team I led, we proved that Paul Manafort was sharing internal polling data with a Russian intelligence officer during the campaign. Where I have an issue is that at some point it was necessary to revisit that decision not to follow the money, the way we did with Paul Manafort. And that's something that we didn't do. And so you end up with this report in the New York Times. And I looked at it, frankly, with sort of personal regret as to, is that something that we should have done?
So if you had, though, even at that late date, would the risk of being fired have been greater? And would being fired from the probe at that late date perhaps provided some insight that Americans needed? I'm just wondering, as you look back, and of course it's always easier looking back, to say this could have happened. But, I mean, was there enough consideration that we need to go back to the money no matter what?
I think there are two answers to that. My view is that later in the investigation, we should have crossed that red line that the White House was putting down with respect to a financial investigation and followed the money, even if it risked being fired. One of the mantras that I talk about in the book was a number of us saying, better to be fired. We had to do our job, and if that resulted at that point, after having produced a lot of results and showing the American public what the Russians were up to, what the campaign manager was up to in providing information to Russian intelligence, that at that point it was better to cross that line. Because right now, although we have the New York Times reporting, there are a lot of unanswered questions, such as who does he owe, who the president owes $400 million to? And one of the leads that we have that's on that question is Eric Trump in 2014 made the statement that the Trump Organization does not rely on American banks for money. They have enough funding from Russian sources. And that's something we don't have the answers to.
Andrew, it's Willie. The book that's out today goes in and lists several instances where you were frustrated that the investigation didn't push further or at least go harder at Donald Trump. You talked about the finances, the financial ties to Russia. You talked about subpoenaing the president himself and the president's family. And you also talk about obstruction. And you say you were frustrated that Robert Mueller didn't explicitly and clearly come out and say that there was criminal obstruction here. You made the case that he should say that. What was his argument back to you? Why not take that step?
Robert Mueller, in making that decision, was motivated by the purest of reasons. His concern was that if you publicly say that the president has committed a wrong, at the same time, you are not able, under Department of Justice policy, which we were bound to follow. We had no choice but to follow that since we were part of the Department of Justice. We could not indict the president. And his concern was that the president would not have his day in court. So it came from a very noble place, the idea that he would not actually label the facts that were laid out in the obstruction of justice part of the report. My argument, as I lay out in the book, is that under the special counsel rules, we were supposed to write an internal report to the Department of Justice. It was the Attorney General's decision whether to make that public or not. So we had every right under the rules to set out what happened. And this is really where I think one of the things I laid out was that we did not anticipate the treachery of Attorney General Barr, who at that point, remember, he had just started. People thought he might be an institutionalist. He was a personal friend of Robert Mueller. And he basically hoodwinked us and said it was all right not to issue that finding, only to have him on March 24th, 2019, a day I will never forget, and I recount in detail in the introduction, to issue a purported summary of our report that was nothing like our report at all.
Well, thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.